The morning of October 14, 1992 started like any other Tuesday in the small town of Millbrook. Richard Hayes, a 34-year-old City Hall clerk, kissed his wife Sarah goodbye at exactly 7:30 a.m., grabbed his brown leather briefcase, and walked out the front door of their modest two-story house on Maple Street. He was wearing his usual navy blue suit, white shirt, and red tie, the same outfit he wore every Tuesday for the past 8 years of working at the municipal building. Richard was the kind of man who lived by routine. Coffee at 6:45, breakfast at 7, out the door at 7:30, and at his desk by 8 sharp. He handled building permits, parking violations, and various administrative duties with the precision of a Swiss watch. Everyone in town knew Richard. He was polite, helpful, and had never missed a day of work in his entire career. That Tuesday was supposed to be no different. But Richard Hayes never made it to City Hall that morning. In fact, he never made it anywhere. At 8:15 a.m., when Richard failed to appear at his desk, his supervisor Margaret Collins assumed he was running late due to traffic. By 9 a.m., she was concerned. By 10 a.m., she was worried. Richard had never been late without calling, not once in 8 years. Margaret picked up the phone and dialed Richard's home number. Sarah answered on the third ring, her voice cheerful and unsuspecting. "Oh, hi Margaret. Richard left right on time this morning, same as always. Is everything okay?" Margaret's heart sank. "Sarah, Richard never showed up to work today." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then Sarah's voice came back, smaller now, uncertain. "That's impossible. He left at 7:30. I watched him walk down the driveway." By noon, Millbrook's small police force had launched a missing person investigation. Officer Tom Bradley, who had known Richard since high school, personally drove the route from the Hayes house to City Hall 3 times, looking for any sign of Richard or clues about what might have happened. The route was simple and straightforward. From Maple Street, Richard would walk 4 blocks north to Main Street, then turn right and walk another 6 blocks to reach the municipal building. It was a pleasant walk through the heart of Millbrook, past the old oak trees that lined the sidewalks, by the corner bakery where Mrs. Patterson always waved hello, and through the small town square with its Civil War memorial. Officer Bradley questioned everyone along the route. Mrs. Patterson at the bakery remembered seeing Richard that morning, walking past her shop at approximately 7:45 a.m. He had waved and smiled, just like he did every day. Mr. Jenkins, who ran the newsstand in the town square, also remembered seeing Richard pass by around 7:50 a.m. He looked perfectly normal, Mr. Jenkins told Officer Bradley. Had his briefcase, walking at his usual pace. Nothing seemed off about him at all. But after the town square, the trail went cold. No one remembered seeing Richard Hayes continue his walk to City Hall that morning. The Millbrook Police Department, consisting of just 4 officers and Chief Walter Murphy, treated the case with the utmost seriousness. Missing persons were virtually unheard of in their quiet town of 8,000 residents. Crime was limited to the occasional speeding ticket, domestic dispute, or petty theft. A grown man simply vanishing without a trace was unprecedented. Chief Murphy organized search parties that combed through every inch of Millbrook. They checked the woods surrounding the town, searched abandoned buildings, and questioned hundreds of residents. Richard's photograph was posted on every bulletin board and telephone pole. Local radio station WMIL broadcasted his description every hour on the hour. Richard Hayes was 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighed approximately 170 pounds, had brown hair and brown eyes, and was wearing a navy blue suit when he disappeared. The police emphasized that he had no known enemies, no financial troubles, no history of mental illness, and no reason whatsoever to disappear voluntarily. Sarah Hayes was devastated. She sat in a living room, surrounded by friends and family, clutching Richard's coffee cup from that morning as if it were a lifeline. The cup still had a small ring of coffee at the bottom, cold and forgotten. He was excited about something, Sarah told Detective Bradley during one of many interviews. "I can't put my finger on it, but Richard seemed energetic lately. More so than usual." like he was working on something important. When pressed for details, Sarah explained that for the past few weeks, Richard had been staying late at City Hall, coming home after dark with a preoccupied expression on his face. When she asked about his work, he would simply say he was reviewing old records and making sure everything was in order. The investigation took on new urgency. Detective Bradley and Officer Murphy spent hours at City Hall, going through Richard's desk, his files, and his recent work assignments. They found his workspace meticulously organized, with neat stacks of permits, applications, and correspondence arranged in perfect order. Richard's supervisor, Margaret Collins, provided a detailed account of his recent activities. For the past month, Richard had requested access to the city's archived records, particularly documents dating back to the early 1900s when Millbrook was first incorporated. He said he was working on a special project, Margaret explained. Something about verifying property boundaries and historical land grants. Richard was always thorough in his work, but this project seemed different. He was almost obsessed with it. The archived records were stored in the basement of City Hall, in a dusty room filled with filing cabinets, bound ledgers, and boxes of documents that hadn't been touched in decades. Detective Bradley and Officer Murphy spent hours down there, trying to determine what Richard had been researching. They found evidence that Richard had been systematically going through records from 1890 to 1920, making photocopies of various land deeds, property transfers, and municipal meeting minutes. But they couldn't determine the purpose or significance of his research. Days turned into weeks. The search parties expanded to neighboring towns. The state police were brought in. Richard's photograph appeared in newspapers across the region. But there were no credible sightings, no new leads, and no evidence of what had happened to him. The case began to take on an almost supernatural quality in the minds of Millbrook's residents. How does a man simply vanish in broad daylight on a busy morning, along a route he had walked every day for 8 years? How does he disappear between the town square and City Hall, a distance of just 4 blocks through the heart of town? Some residents began to whisper about the old stories, the legends that had been passed down through generations about Millbrook's early days. There were tales of underground tunnels built during Prohibition, of secret passages connecting important buildings, of mysterious disappearances in the past that had been covered up or forgotten. But these were just stories, folklore passed down by elderly residents and dismissed by most as small-town superstition. Until Richard Hayes disappeared, that is. Then suddenly, people began to wonder if there might be some truth to the old legends. 3 months after Richard's disappearance, the active investigation was scaled back. Chief Murphy kept the case open, but with no new leads and no evidence of foul play, there was little more the small police department could do. Richard Hayes became another unsolved mystery, another name in the filing cabinet of cases that defied explanation. Sarah Hayes struggled to move forward with her life. She kept Richard's desk exactly as he had left it, his coffee cup in the same spot on the kitchen counter, his clothes hanging in their shared closet. Friends and family urged her to consider the possibility that Richard might not be coming back, but Sarah refused to give up hope. "I know he's out there somewhere," she would tell anyone who would listen. "Richard wouldn't just leave. Something happened to him, something we don't understand yet. But he's alive, and someday we'll find out what really happened." The years passed slowly in Millbrook. The Richard Hayes case became part of local lore, a mystery that older residents would discuss on quiet evenings, trying to piece together theories and explanations that never quite satisfied. New residents would learn about the missing clerk from neighbors and shopkeepers, adding to the town's reputation as a place where strange things sometimes happened. Officer Bradley, who had led much of the initial investigation, was promoted to detective and eventually became chief of police when Walter Murphy retired in 2001. Throughout his career, he never stopped thinking about Richard Hayes. The case file remained on his desk, and he would review it periodically, hoping to spot something that had been overlooked. The municipal building where Richard had worked underwent several renovations over the years. The basement archive room was reorganized multiple times, with old records being digitized and stored electronically. But no one ever found any additional clues about Richard's research or what he might have discovered in those old documents. Sarah Hayes eventually remarried in 1998, to a kind man named Robert Chen who understood her need to keep Richard's memory alive. They kept the house on Maple Street, and Sarah maintained a small shrine to Richard in their spare bedroom, with his photograph, his briefcase, and some of his personal belongings arranged carefully on a desk. As the years turned into decades, Richard Hayes became something of a legend in Millbrook. His story was featured in true crime magazines, investigated by amateur sleuths, and discussed on internet forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries. But no credible new evidence ever emerged. The town continued to grow and change. New businesses opened, old buildings were torn down or renovated, and younger generations moved in while older residents passed away. But the mystery of Richard Hayes persisted, an unsolved puzzle that defined Millbrook as much as its historic town square or annual harvest festival. In 2010, 18 years after Richard's disappearance, Chief Bradley retired and turned the case files over to his replacement, Chief Maria Santos. She was the first person to lead the department who hadn't been personally involved in the original investigation, and she brought fresh eyes to the old mystery. Chief Santos spent hours reviewing the case files, witness statements, and evidence reports. She was struck by the thoroughness of the original investigation and the complete lack of viable leads or explanations. Richard Hayes had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind a loving wife, a steady job, and a life that gave no indication he wanted or needed to disappear. The only unusual aspect of Richard's behavior, according to the files, was his intense research into Millbrook's historical records in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Chief Santos decided to take a closer look at this angle, something that perhaps hadn't been fully explored in the original investigation. She spent several afternoons in the basement archives of City Hall, going through the same types of documents that Richard had been studying. The records were fascinating from a historical perspective, detailing Millbrook's transformation from a small farming community to a proper incorporated town. Chief Santos discovered that Richard had been particularly interested in property records from 1895 to 1905, a period when the town had experienced rapid growth and development. During this time, several important buildings had been constructed, including the original City Hall, the first bank, the post office, and the town's first hotel. What caught Chief Santos' attention was a pattern in the land transfers during this period. Several large parcels of land had been sold by the same family, the Whitmore family, to various developers and the town government. The Whitmores had been early settlers who owned significant portions of what would become downtown Millbrook. According to the records, the Whitmore family had insisted on specific clauses in their land sales, reserving certain underground rights and requiring that any future construction respect existing subterranean structures. The language was archaic and somewhat vague, but it suggested that there were already underground spaces or tunnels beneath the land being sold. Chief Santos found this intriguing, especially given the local legends about underground tunnels and secret passages. She began to research the Whitmore family more thoroughly, using resources that hadn't been available to the original investigators in 1992. What she discovered was remarkable. The Whitmore family had indeed been involved in some unusual construction projects in the late 1800s. According to Historical Society records and old newspaper archives, Patriarch Edmund Whitmore had been something of an eccentric who believed in preparing for uncertain times. Edmund Whitmore had reportedly constructed an elaborate system of underground tunnels and storage rooms beneath his property, connecting his house to various important locations around what would become downtown Millbrook. The tunnels were said to be spacious enough for adults to walk through comfortably, with proper ventilation and even electric lighting once electricity became available. The tunnels were reportedly used during Prohibition to store and transport illegal alcohol, and later during World War II as a potential shelter in case of enemy attack. But after Edmund Whitmore's death in 1943, knowledge of the tunnel system had apparently died with him. Chief Santos realized that if these tunnels truly existed, they might provide an explanation for Richard Hayes' disappearance. Perhaps he had discovered something about the tunnels in his research, found an entrance, and gotten lost or trapped underground. The theory was compelling, but Chief Santos faced a significant challenge: how to locate and explore tunnel systems that had been hidden for over a century, if they existed at all. She began by consulting with the town's public works department, looking for any unusual utility maps or construction reports that might indicate underground spaces. She also reached out to local historians, elderly residents, and anyone who might have knowledge of the Whitmore tunnels. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Robert Chen, who had married Sarah Hayes in 1998, contacted Chief Santos with information he thought might be relevant to the case. Robert explained that while cleaning out Sarah's attic in 2011, he had discovered a box of Richard's personal belongings that had been stored and forgotten. Among the items was a notebook that Richard had apparently kept during his research into Millbrook's historical records. Sarah was too emotional to go through it when we first found it, Robert explained. But I looked through it recently, and I think you should see what Richard wrote. The notebook contained detailed notes about the Whitmore family, sketches of what appeared to be tunnel layouts, and most importantly, a map that Richard had apparently drawn based on his research. The map showed the locations of several potential tunnel entrances, including one that was marked City Hall Basement, Northeast Corner. Chief Santos felt a surge of excitement. Richard Hayes had not only discovered the existence of the Whitmore tunnel system, but he had apparently figured out how to access it from the basement of City Hall. The next step was obvious: explore the basement of City Hall and look for the entrance that Richard had marked on his map. Chief Santos assembled a small team that included herself, 2 officers, a member of the Public Works Department, and a local contractor who had experience with underground construction. They equipped themselves with flashlights, rope, first aid supplies, and communication equipment. The basement of City Hall had been renovated several times since 1992, but the northeast corner that Richard had marked on his map was still largely unchanged. It was used primarily for storage, with old furniture, boxes of documents, and unused office equipment stacked against the walls. The team began by moving all the stored items away from the northeast corner, revealing the original brick and concrete walls from the building's construction in 1901. At first glance, everything appeared normal. But as they examined the walls more carefully, they noticed something unusual. One section of the brick wall, about 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, appeared slightly different from the rest. The bricks were the same age and style, but the mortar between them was subtly different in color and texture, as if this section had been bricked up and sealed at some point after the original construction. The contractor confirmed their suspicions. "This section has definitely been bricked up," he said. "Probably sometime in the 1940s or 1950s, based on the mortar composition. There's something behind this wall." Chief Santos made the decision to break through the sealed section of wall. Using sledgehammers and careful precision, the team began to remove the bricks that had hidden whatever lay behind them for more than 60 years. After removing several rows of bricks, they revealed a dark opening beyond. Cool air flowed from the space behind the wall, carrying with it a musty smell of age and dampness. Chief Santos shined her flashlight into the opening and gasped. Beyond the sealed wall was a brick-lined tunnel, approximately 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall, stretching into darkness in both directions. The tunnel was exactly as the historical records had described, spacious enough for adults to walk through comfortably, with arched brick ceilings and what appeared to be the remnants of old electrical wiring along the walls. "My God," whispered one of the officers. "The tunnels are real." Chief Santos felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They had confirmed the existence of the Whitmore tunnel system, and quite possibly discovered how Richard Hayes had disappeared 32 years earlier. But they still didn't know what had happened to him down there, or whether he was still alive. The team prepared to enter the tunnel system, but Chief Santos insisted on following proper safety protocols. They contacted the state police and the FBI, informing them of the discovery and requesting assistance with a potentially dangerous underground exploration. Within hours, a specialized team had arrived in Millbrook, including expert cave rescue personnel, forensic investigators, and equipment for exploring and mapping underground spaces. The discovery of the tunnel system had transformed a decades-old missing person case into a major investigation with national implications. The first exploration of the tunnels revealed an extensive and sophisticated underground network. The main tunnel ran in a straight line from City Hall to what had once been the Whitmore family property, a distance of approximately half a mile. Along the way, several smaller tunnels branched off, connecting to the basements of other historic buildings in downtown Millbrook. The tunnels were remarkably well preserved, considering their age. The brickwork was solid, the ventilation was still functional, and many sections still had working electric lighting. It was clear that the tunnel system had been maintained and used regularly well into the mid-20th century. But most importantly, the tunnels were not empty. About halfway through the main tunnel, the exploration team made a discovery that would change everything. In a wider section that appeared to have been used as a storage or meeting area, they found evidence of recent habitation: a table, several chairs, boxes of supplies, and what appeared to be living quarters that had been occupied for an extended period. And sitting calmly at the table, as if he had been expecting visitors, was Richard Hayes. He was older, of course, with gray hair and deep lines in his face. He was thin but appeared healthy, wearing simple clothes and a calm expression that suggested he was not surprised to see the rescue team. When Chief Santos approached him, he looked up and smiled. "Hello, Chief Santos," he said quietly. "I wondered when someone would finally find this place." The rescue team was stunned. Richard Hayes, who had been missing for 32 years, was alive and apparently well, living in the underground tunnel system beneath Millbrook. "Richard," Chief Santos said carefully, "we've been looking for you for over 30 years. Your wife, your family, the whole town, everyone thought you were dead." Richard nodded slowly. "I know. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. But I couldn't leave." "Not yet." "What do you mean, you couldn't leave?" Richard stood up from his chair and gestured for them to follow him deeper into the tunnel system. "Let me show you why I stayed." As they walked through the tunnels, Richard explained what had happened on that October morning in 1992. He had indeed discovered the entrance to the tunnel system in the basement of City Hall, just as Chief Santos had suspected. His research into the historical records had led him to believe that the tunnels contained something important, something that had been hidden for decades. "I found the entrance and decided to explore," Richard explained. "I thought I would just take a quick look and then go to work. But what I discovered down here changed everything." Richard led them to a large chamber that had been carved out of the rock beneath Millbrook. The chamber was filled with wooden crates, filing cabinets, and shelves lined with documents and artifacts. It was like discovering a hidden museum or archive. "This is what Edmund Whitmore really built," Richard said. "Not just tunnels for transportation or storage, but a repository. A place to preserve the real history of Millbrook and the surrounding area." Chief Santos examined some of the documents and artifacts. They appeared to be genuine historical items: Native American artifacts, documents relating to early European settlement, records of land disputes and treaties, and evidence of events that had apparently been omitted from official histories. "Whitmore was documenting things that powerful people wanted forgotten," Richard explained. "Land theft, violence against Native Americans, corruption in early territorial government. He was creating a record that told the truth about how this region was really settled and developed." Richard had spent the morning of October 14, 1992, exploring the chamber and reading through some of the documents. He quickly realized that he had discovered something of tremendous historical and possibly legal significance. "I knew I had to document everything carefully," Richard said. "But I also knew that if word got out about this place, it would be looted or destroyed. So I made a decision that I know seems crazy, but it felt necessary at the time." Richard had decided to stay in the tunnels temporarily, to catalog and preserve the historical materials before revealing their existence to the world. He had expected to be underground for a few days at most, long enough to photograph the most important documents and create a proper inventory. But as he worked through the materials, he kept discovering new chambers, new documents, and new evidence of historical events that had been covered up or forgotten. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. "I kept telling myself I would finish the work and return to the surface," Richard said. "But there was always more to discover, more to preserve. And I began to realize that I was probably the only person who would ever have the time and dedication to do this work properly." Richard had created a comprehensive catalog of everything in the underground chambers. He had photographed thousands of documents, mapped the entire tunnel system, and organized the materials by time period and topic. It was a massive undertaking that had consumed 32 years of his life. "What about your wife?" Chief Santos asked. "Sarah never remarried until 1998, 6 years after you disappeared. She waited for you, hoped you would come back." Richard's face showed deep sadness and regret. "That's the hardest part," he said quietly. "I thought about Sarah every single day. I wanted to contact her, to let her know I was alive, but I couldn't risk exposing this place before the work was finished." "And is it finished now?" Richard nodded. "Yes. I've cataloged everything, preserved all the important documents, and created detailed maps and inventories. The work is complete." Richard had spent over 3 decades living alone in the underground chambers, sustained by supplies that he obtained through careful nighttime expeditions to the surface. He had accessed buildings through the tunnel system, taking only what he needed to survive while avoiding detection. "I became something of a ghost," Richard admitted. "I think some people in town occasionally saw signs of my presence, but no one ever connected it to my disappearance." The discovery of Richard Hayes in the Whitmore Historical Repository became one of the most significant archaeological and historical finds in the region's history. The materials that Richard had preserved and catalogued provided unprecedented insight into the true history of the area, including evidence of injustices and cover-ups that had been hidden for more than a century. Richard's dedication to preserving these historical materials was recognized by historians and archaeologists, but his decision to abandon his family and previous life remained controversial. Some viewed him as a hero who had sacrificed everything to preserve important history. Others saw him as a man who had selfishly abandoned his responsibilities and caused tremendous pain to those who loved him. Sarah Hayes, now Sarah Chen, was faced with the impossible situation of reuniting with a husband who had been presumed dead for 32 years, while being married to another man who had loved and supported her through decades of grief and uncertainty. The reunion was emotional and complicated. Sarah was overjoyed to learn that Richard was alive, but also angry and hurt that he had chosen to stay hidden for so long. Robert Chen, her second husband, was understanding but devastated by the situation. Richard understood that his return created an impossible situation for everyone involved. After long conversations with both Sarah and Robert, he made the difficult decision to not attempt to resume his old life or disrupt the new family that Sarah had built. Instead, Richard remained in Millbrook as the official curator of the Whitmore Historical Repository, which was designated as a protected archaeological site. He lived in a small apartment above the Historical Society, spending his days giving tours of the tunnel system and helping researchers access the materials he had preserved. Sarah and Richard maintained a friendship, but she remained married to Robert. It was a complex arrangement that reflected the impossible nature of the situation Richard's 32-year absence had created. The case of Richard Hayes became a landmark study in the ethics of historical preservation, the psychology of obsession, and the consequences of extreme dedication to a cause. Richard had indeed preserved important historical materials, but at tremendous personal cost to himself and the people who loved him. Today, the Whitmore Historical Repository attracts researchers and visitors from around the world. The tunnel system has been made safe for public access, and the historical materials that Richard preserved have contributed to a more complete and accurate understanding of the region's past. Richard Hayes, now in his 70s, continues to serve as the repository's curator. He has never married again, and maintains a quiet, solitary life dedicated to the historical work that cost him everything else. The town of Millbrook has embraced its unique history and the mystery that defined it for so many years. The Richard Hayes case is featured prominently in the town's tourism materials, and the tunnel tours are one of the area's most popular attractions. But for those who knew Richard and Sarah in 1992, the resolution of the mystery is bittersweet. Richard Hayes was found alive, but the cost of his 32-year disappearance was the loss of the life and relationships he had before he walked into those tunnels. The case serves as a reminder that some mysteries, even when solved, leave behind questions that can never be fully answered. What drives someone to abandon everything for a cause? How do you weigh personal responsibility against historical preservation? And what happens to love when time and choices create gaps that can never be fully bridged? Richard Hayes found what he was looking for in those underground chambers, a complete and accurate record of history that might otherwise have been lost forever. But in the process, he lost himself, and left behind a different kind of mystery, not where he had gone, but whether the price he paid was worth what he preserved.